Kang. Render. I just need to, like, I don't know, put a sound effect in there that it just says kang, so I don't have to say that every time we do.
That'll be the new animation. It'll just be kang.
The kang.
I want that as a ringtone.
Somebody was in the chat last week and they were like, kang. They love the kang. And also, I didn't know if you knew this, you guys, but urban slang is. Well, I think in Philly is Mike. You know about the kang. I taught you that one. You know, when you got the washboard abs and it makes that sound when you rub your hands across it.
I thought that was just you're cramping with your posing from denying yourself fluid, so you're actually ripped. It's like it's kang. You're like
you dry it out.
Yeah,
it's like you got the washboard abs. You can wash your shirt against these. Guys, everybody, welcome back to your favorite pandemic podcast, Pencil to Pencil. That's right, not Pencil Pencil, Pencil to Pencil. Brought to you every week, every Wednesday at 8 p.m. EST. I am pleased to introduce myself. I'm Philadelphia's favorite son, and some people say I have many nicknames. I think you've heard that. Some of them, one of my favorites is Johnny Carson, your Philadelphia host. That's wild stuff. And also Captain Scholastic. I don't feel like I've earned that one yet, but I'm going to keep working.
Are you gonna like start having puppets follow you around? You're in your Captain Scholastic. You're gonna have like hand puppets.
I need a really cool blazer, like a crushed velvet blazer, to go with that. I think let me work on it. Let me introduce the rest of the crew here, my fine feathered friends. I would be remiss. I say that all the time. I would be remiss if I did not introduce.
You can just rerun this part of the show.
This is my favorite part. I'm just riffing. I would be remiss if I did not introduce our newest co-host in the world heavyweight champion of webcomics, Stone Cold Steve Conley. Hello, Steve Conley. How are you, sir?
Fantastic. Good to see you guys.
Steve, what's new in your world? Anything new out of the studio?
I'm shipping another Kickstarter. I've got 2 boxes left, including a little something for Mr. JRD, Notorious JRD.
Look at that. Very excited. If only we could all be Notorious JRD for a moment, just to open that mail. I'm excited for him. And also, the third part of this triangle, the full bird kernel of comic book illustration.
I got to get promoted, man. Too long.
El Generalissimo, Mike Manley.
I need one of those big brim hats with all the crusties on it.
I love it. You need that. We're gonna have to make that for you. Mike Manley, how you feeling?
Okay. I'm fighting a little bit of a sinus infection.
Oh no, that's the worst. And it's just the season, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get them in the summer, but when I get them in the fall, for some reason, I get the sinus infections.
You know, those are the worst, man. I haven't really had those, but
Makes my teeth hurt.
Oh wow, yeah. That's like. See, I guess would that apply as a seasonal allergy?
No. It's just something about when we get that first like really big cold snap.
Yeah,
and so I'm on some drugs now.
So. You on a drip?
A very special episode of Pencil to Pencil.
That's right. Tom Hanks is eating all the maraschino cherries again. You guys, we had a really interesting Pencil to Pencil last week where we had a boot camp. I'm not going to put the graphic up. I don't want to confuse anybody. And
don't scare them away.
Yeah.
No, I'm not prepared.
And something that was very interesting that we talked about, we touched on the bugaboo about AI, and not Allen Iverson. We're talking about AI art. And it's such, you know what? It's still spinning.
The churn is huge. It's just like an endless
churning. And you know, I wonder how our guest tonight feels about it. But I was trying to, and
he's already been turned into a robot. In the green room.
Last week we had Steve kind of introduce what it was, because I think sometimes it's hard to explain what it is. So if you're not of this circle and just like, hey, what is this? I just found this app that made me look like a Matisse painting. What's wrong with that? And trying to just kind of break this down,
Yeah.
as to what is the real issue with it. And I think that's just going to keep going. I wonder, before we get started with Pat, has anybody had any new kind of like interactions with this AI stuff since last week? Anything new?
Yeah, I saw. Well, now the new thing is going around today, which I saw people posting no AI art. But then I saw somebody post a book this morning. Saw somebody who got AI to write the story, and then AI to do the art. So they made this kids book. So they got the robot to write the story, and then they used the prompts from the story to make the art for their kids.
That's crazy.
And then I saw somebody else, and he's like all proud holding his book. Hey, look what I did! I made my book, in like in an hour, or whatever. And then like just people were like driving by and like throwing bricks at his head.
Yeah.
Like, you're not, so and I posted a couple things on my wall. One which, and I've had a lot of discussions on, specifically on Facebook, because I don't truck with Twitter anymore. Is you have to understand how things work, like trademark, how things work, like copyright. You have to understand what fair use is. And so if you're not familiar with what those terms are, how they're applied, then you can kind of get confused about, like people like, well, we just need to, band together, and that's not.
Let's put on a play.
Yeah, it's like it's not how it works, And there have not been laws written for AI yet. I think probably it'll be written in Europe before it's written in the United States. But there are laws on the books that apply to copyright and apply to licensing and apply to trademark. And the other thing is, because I've gone through this process of suing someone for trademark infringement, you have to demonstrate that they did it. Then you also have to have the money to hire the lawyer.
Well, that's how they get you.
Right. And a trademark lawyer, and this is 20 years ago. A trademark lawyer 20 years ago was $200 an hour. So I'm imagining it's a little bit more expensive even now. But, people just say, well, you're going to sue or this, or you need to get a union or whatever. That's not how you're going to settle this. I think what will happen is the big corporations who stand to lose the most from having people, because I saw people making images of Mickey Mouse using AI and all this stuff and trying to make t-shirts. Disney and museums and estates of very famous artists, they will be the ones who say, go and lobby Congress, lobby their senator, and probably get something introduced, because they don't care about you if you're a freelancer. You're not generating any heat. You're not one of their constituents that they really care about. But Disney, lobbied to extend the trademark, to what was it, 96 years or something like that. So they will be the ones who, these corporations will be the ones who probably take this on. It'll probably happen in Europe faster than in the United States. But so I posted this thing about fair use, and it talked about like the Obama poster.
The Shepherd Ferry Obey poster. Yeah.
Famous case of that. And, what is considered fair use in a classroom, what is considered to be fair use with parody, and then what is, trademark or copyright infringement. Like you could go get a picture of a horse off the internet and you could use that as reference, but you can't use it cold. You'd have to substantially
doctor it or alter it. Yeah.
And I seem to remember there would have to be more than 30%.
Oh, there's a ratio.
More than 30%. Yeah. If you just take it and put a filter on it and go, ding, now this is my horse, and then the other thing is, if somebody takes your stuff and because I saw a couple of comic book artists who are already saying that somebody had taken their comic book art and had used AI and was making new comic book art based upon their comic book art. Right.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Right. But the thing is like, and then somebody sent me this link to, it's called Have You Been Trained? Which you can go and put an image in.
Wait, you're sure we're talking about the same site?
Right. You can put, you put the dog collar on. you can put your image in and it will search to see if your image has been sourced somehow. And so I had a Superman Adventures cover on my phone that I'd drawn. So I popped it in there. And of course, I think all my Superman Adventure covers for DC have been used, but I don't own the trademark. I don't own the copyright.
Right. You drew.
So it doesn't matter, right? There's no way I could sue them anyway, right? That's the other thing. If you're working for Marvel or DC, like just take Jim Lee, right? Super popular, lots of work for Marvel and DC. If you took that thing and you made Jim Lee art, he couldn't really sue you. He couldn't sue them. It would have to be Marvel or Disney or DC because they're the ones that own the trademark. When you sign your voucher, you give up all the rights to that artwork. So there's a lot of real gray areas that are not defined. But then you also, if it's just some kid, there were 3 guys in broke ass studios using AI and sourcing their favorite cartoonists, you're not going to get any money out of those people. If you go like, okay, I won my lawsuit, I want $10,000 per infraction.
Hey, Mike, there's a question, and then we're gonna get started. What up, Kirk's Pencils? One of my favorite new faces around here. Kirk's Pencils asks, "What's the penalty for using someone's work? Do you have any idea about that?"
Well, I mean, again, we were just discussing that. If you own if it's your personal work, you could sue somebody for copyright. Okay. But you're gonna have to have a lawyer, and then it may not be worth suing that person for copyright because if it's just some schmo, by the time you hired your lawyer at $500 retainer or $1,500 retainer, $200 an hour, you track the people down, 3 or 4 years might go by with the going through the courts. You got court fees and everything. I'm just going by what my experience was in my instance. It actually may not be worth it.
Well, I'll say this, as I don't know, there's a little secret you guys don't know about me. I'm a giant fantasy football player, and
I thought you were giant fantasy.
To some people, I am. And in our football league, which is kind of sponsored, like it's like a GUI where you get all your stats and everything. At the end of every week, there is a news wire that kind of generates, and it's just like, hey, Jamar's team trampled the other guys by 76 points, and it's written so well, you think there's some intern writing this. It's a bot. And then they've had that for at least 4 or 5 years.
All these call centers, they were saying, that have these, you call Comcast or you call whatever, and there's some, guy in Mexico or some person in India. All those are going away because they're training the bots right now, and the bots are going to take over, and you will never talk to another human being.
Unilab is going to take your job.
Right, you're going to only talk to a robot. I mean, they've been working on that for a while.
What are you going to say, Steve?
Well, I don't think we're not going to have any help with the courts, but I do think we still have shame. We can still shame people, and that's what we. It's all we've got. As long as shame still resonates and works on some people, it clearly doesn't on some. But if we can, NFTs weren't defeated technologically. They were defeated because they were shamed out of existence, and then they were a scam. But also on top of it, there was a huge shame component where artists didn't want to touch it, even though there was the promise of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
I think if people know that AI is distasteful and is basically, it's not art, it's just mulching existing stolen artwork. If people then basically just label it as such. So that's AI. I don't want to support that. Well, once it loses its financial incentive, then people will stop doing it.
I was having a talk with Blevins about this today, and he seems to think, and I kind of agree that certain parts of the commercial art profession, you will probably almost be forced into using it as part of your process, just because they're going to want, since this can do things faster, they're going to, want things to go faster. I mean, I remember when I had my first fax machine, that was before the internet. And then all of a sudden, oh man, you don't draw something and mail it to the office. And then everything was working at the speed of the fax, right? Then you went to the speed of the internet, the old dial-up. I think that a lot of, like you say, you have a car, or you want to do cities, or you want to do certain background things. You can pop all that stuff in there and it can spit it out as line art. I think that's what's going to happen in animation and maybe even, I mean, there's already people doing comics with it. They're not good.
But we need a picket line. We need a picket line, and if people cross it, I'm not saying we have to organize it. That doesn't have to be a bake sale. That doesn't have to be a dance off. It just has to be, just use shame while we still can, while people still have to look at themselves in the mirror.
Well, what would be a shame if we did not bring our guest on.
Absolutely.
You see, that's how this works around here. And if this is your first time watching Pencil to Pencil, what happens here is that while we are streaming live, you, dear viewer, have the chance to interact with expert cartoonists and ask us really good questions. So this will be a perfect segue to bring in our guest. And Mike, you want to talk about Patrick, and then we'll bring him in?
Okay. Well, Patrick's been in the business a long time. He's had great runs on. I was just perusing his litany,
his archives.
Yeah. Well, he had Spider-Man, Thor, Hero Alliance, She-Hulk, Nomad, Warlock, Untold Tales of Spider-Man, Spider-Girl, his own Edgeworld series. He's done a lot of great work over a long time, and I think I even got to ink him once in the very, very beginning. I think it might have been some Nomad pencils or something. But
oh wow.
Yeah, it's funny. Every once in a while, I remember, like, oh yeah, I did. They would break up jobs. Like sometimes they would do one of those Marvel hands things. Like, this guy gets 2 pages. This guy gets 2 pages. This guy gets
mini hands. Yeah.
So no, he's a great guy. We actually interviewed him in the magazine, Draw magazine. He's a great guy. I love his stuff. And we were hoping to actually get to work on a project together sometime soon. So,
well, never say never. So, welcome to Pencil. You're a friend of mine. I got to get this stuff ready. Patrick Ollliffe. Look look at that. You got rendered. Did you
There
see
you
this?
go.
The 3D print was the resin needs to dry, and then you'll be good.
Then we have to go cut the flashing off.
Yeah, we got to we have to score you a little bit. I hope that's okay. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Sure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on.
Sure. Sure.
Patrick, I hope we didn't kind of like make you get restless leg syndrome waiting to come on in the green room.
No.
You weren't like making a noose. Well, here comes AI. Might as well.
No, because it's actually, Mike, you mentioned that the like today, there's all those posts on social media with the big / no AI and all that kind of stuff. So it really has, AI has been kind of percolating in the background for a little bit, but all of a sudden, just recently, it's really become a big thing in our community, especially in the illustration community. And I even saw a post that an AI program created a model. A woman who was a model. She didn't exist. They gave her a name. It was created through AI, and someone was saying, this is how the modeling industry is going to go. I mean, you don't have to pay a model all this time and money and fly her to here or do whatever. You just make it an AI, and boom, you put her in an ad, and there you go. So it really is it's a problem in our little neck of the woods, but it is fairly expansive too. And I'm not really sure where it goes now. I was interested to hear, Mike, your comments about what you thought would be happening next and who really would be kind of the guys at the forefront of this kind of thing. You're right. The average freelancer is not going to be able to make a dent in any of this stuff. But you get somebody on a corporate level, and they're worried about, and they cite, copyright infringement, and they get lawyers involved, and that's when things might change. But it's so new and it's happening so quickly. I don't think we completely know where it's headed, but it certainly is disturbing. So,
I mean, you thought those robot dogs with the guns in their back were scary.
We keep kicking them to see if they would fall over? And
yeah, those videos were crazy.
See if they'd shoot you.
I do not want that job. All right, Kitty, push the robot again.
Well, one of the interesting things is that artists are, pretty up in arms about it. But I asked this on my Facebook feed, like, what will sort of determine it too is like, will our fans be happy to go like, well, I don't ever need to see Pat Olliff ever at another convention. I can just type in Pat Olliff and I can get all the, John Byrne. I just get all the John Byrne comics I want. You're not going to get any autographs then, or it's like,
right, exactly. And then at the same time, it also becomes a situation as storytellers is that you can get an AI. I heard you tell that story about the guy that did the children's book. So he has a couple prompts, and a children's book story is written. Well, essentially, that is competition to a certain extent. But we all have our own voices, right? So an AI is going to cobble together all the things it has access to create a voice. But it's not going to be Jamar's voice. It's not going to be Steve's voice, Mike's voice, or my voice specifically. There is a uniqueness to what each of us are saying. Mm-hmm. And so as we move forward, is it competition for us? Because it takes some jobs, and it could be a big problem, sure. But at the same time, the thing that we have that is unique to us, that is our voice, our storytelling ideas, our choices, our voice, and I think that is really the only thing that we have to leverage moving forward to kind of keep yourself viable.
Yeah. I was saying the other week that if you just took like somebody like Kirby, who had very distinct styles and periods. You had the 40s Kirby, right. You had the 50s Kirby, sort of like his more straight-laced stuff. Then you had the stuff he did at DC. And then you had the early Marvel Kirby, and then you had what people think of as Jack Kirby with the squiggles and everything, right? So Here, there was a person who evolved over time. What an AI is like, it could only go to the cadaver and go like, well, what can I pick? It's not going to invent something new, right?
Right, and if it even if it got to the point where it invented something new, it's not going to invent something that you could come up with or I would come up. You know what I mean? It will cobble together certain things to create a product, but there is a uniqueness based on our own experiences to the voices that each of us have. And I think that's really the only thing we're going to be able to leverage moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the some real art for a second.
Yeah.
and let's talk about Patrick and your maybe for the layman, which I usually play that role a lot. I love talking to artists who have had such a storied career, and you've kind of been all over the earth in certain ways. So, and one of the things that we always ask here on Pencil to Pencil is to hear your origin story, or like kind of how you got started. But before we ask that, I would love to maybe ask you a question. Kind of, if somebody asked me this question, I've been dealing with it for a while. Is what would Patrick from 20 years ago say about the Patrick now? Hope that's not too obtuse.
No. It's interesting because I think the Patrick of 20 years ago, I was in a different place in my career where I was getting a lot of work. Now, I was never an artist that got I never got necessarily the top level books. I was never on Batman or the Avengers, that kind of stuff. But I have done a lot of great characters, and I've been able to work in this business that I loved. But 20 years ago, I was a different place. The work was easier to come by.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So I was finishing up a project, contact an editor or talk to someone. Oh, hey, we have this something. We have 2 issues here, 3 issues here. We have the mini series here. We have the series, and so that was kind of like the rolling train, and that was kind of like I got into. I know we can jump back to this, but I got into Marvel, and with some Tales of Asgard, then did some Thor, then Nomad, and then it just kind of builds. Then Untold Tales of Spider-Man, and then so 20 years ago, it was kind of easier to manage in terms of a workflow. Now, 20 years hence, where I'm now old, where it's more of a challenge because the jobs are not as available, and to a certain extent, it makes sense because younger guys are coming in. I mean, so younger guys are flowing into the marketplace. They're looking for jobs too, and I've been around a long time. So editors and companies are looking for younger guys, newer voices, or whatever. I may or may not agree with that approach, but it has 20 years ago, I would have told myself, hey, look, this is not always going to be this way. It's going to change. So you have to be ready to pivot. I mean, you have to be ready to really be able to not just stare in one direction and just think, okay, I'm just going to keep chugging along, Marvel, DC. Hey, that'll be great. Mm-hmm. But you have to be able, at some point, you're going to have to be able to make some changes, to pivot in a different direction, to find other avenues for yourself, other ways to market yourself. I mean, I think that was the biggest change in the last 20 years, is that I find myself, having been in the industry as long as I have, trying to find a way to, in fact, there was a job that I had, I won't mention the editor. There was a job that I had, and the writer wanted me, suggested me for the title. I did a little sample piece, and the editor said, oh yeah, Pat's work. I mean, he said, yeah, he's great, but we already know what he does. So they went in a direction with a newer guy, and I said, okay. So, and that's the challenge of where I am now, 20 years later from that point where I really didn't have to think about that as much.
Yeah, I mean, that's something really deep to think about. And, there's so many different levels of viewers that we have here on the channel. There's other pros. There's some elders, as we call them. And there's people who were just getting their feet wet, and there's amateurs, and there's people all in the middle. And I think, even just have the conversation to somebody who's so young, they don't have a body of work. They probably haven't done 5 pages in a row.
Right.
To then think in the future, oh well, there might be a point where you don't get work because I hate to say the phrase aging out because I don't believe in that. I think it's real in its own way, but I don't think that is necessarily its own thing. But just to think about like how do you sustain it? So, and then I'll ask you about your origin, but how have you started to maybe implement technology into your work? Talking about AI again, or maybe even like drawing digitally, or are you still traditional, anything like that?
Well, I think a couple of years ago, I did decide to start experimenting with digital artwork. I'd seen a lot of guys using digital work, iPads or Cintiqs and all that kind of stuff, and I'd always kind of resisted it, but I was comfortable doing the approach that I'd always had done. Excuse me. But a couple of years ago, I kind of said, okay, I need to bite the bullet here because this is changing. And not and what I saw was a lot of these guys, especially younger guys, doing their work digitally, and they would all comment how fast they were. It was faster than traditional, and I thought, in order to, one of the things I wanted to do more of is ink my own work, but I wasn't fast enough to do that on a regular monthly title or anything. But I see all these guys using digital work. I thought, well, maybe that's something I need to experiment with. Plus, they were getting techniques that I couldn't get traditionally. Now, like it or don't like it, but there are some techniques, brushes, whatever, that are easily accessible and that can be used in the production of art digitally that I couldn't do traditionally. So I thought, okay, I'll experiment with it. Let's see what happens. So, so what I did was I decided to, I got an iPad Pro, and I used, I know a lot of people use Procreate, but I use Clip Studio just because that's more familiar to me.
Yeah, I didn't mean to fist pump there, but I've just been on a clip thing lately.
Yeah, I mean, I've experimented with Procreate a little bit, and it's really cool. I like a lot of the effects that some other guys are getting out of it. It's going to take a little more of a learning curve for me. Clip Studio just seemed to be more intuitive. I got it quicker. So I started incorporating into the work that I was doing, and so right now, I mean, the series that Mike brought up, my creator of the series I'm doing with Chuck Austin through Comixology called Edgeworld, that started off kind of a hybrid, traditional and digital, and then by the 2 or 3 issues in, it's all digital. All the rest of it's been digital. Some of the artwork that you may post later, some of that couple covers I did was all digital. So it's I think that's it has got, I have gotten a little faster. Unfortunately, what I was hoping is I could get like twice as fast, and it didn't quite work that way. It's a little faster. But yeah, I think that something like that. Now I'm shifting over to digital artwork, and in fact, I did actually lose a freelance job at one point, outside of comics. I had an illustration possibility that was stitching together a bunch of different artists to do this project. And so when they contacted me about it, it sounded really cool. I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. Well, at that
Oh no.
Oh,
We'll have to throw cashews in his frozen mouth.
Hopefully, AI.
There you go.
There you go.
It's the AI thing. It's pissed off.
Yeah, they're coming for you. When the dogs start barking outside, you know that Schwarzenegger's here.
That's it. So anyway, so I lost. The guy said, "Well, I'm sorry. I mean, the only way this works, stitching everybody together, is if you work digitally." And I worked traditionally at that point, so I lost the job. So you can see where it was going. You can see what was coming. So I needed to make that transition. So that's probably the thing that I've done with that in mind. There you go.
See? Don't answer the door, Pat. Don't answer the door. So, well, yeah, I don't want to be the voice here. I'm so excited to talk to you. But maybe this will be a good part to maybe tell us about how you got into comic book illustration. Did you always want to be in the industry? Did you kind of fall into it I'd
No,
love to hear how you started.
My dad got me a Superman comic when I was like 6. And so I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So I would start getting comics. I was, 8, 9, 10, that kind of thing. The first bunch of comics, I never read them. I never thought about reading them. I just looked at the art. I just looked at the pictures. Oh, this is amazing. What is going on? This is incredible. And then I saw, well, there's little words in there. I could read this story too. So as I got older, the hooks were set in pretty early. And then I saw Avengers. I can't blank on the number. It was the Kree-Skrull War that Neil Adams did. That Neil Adams, Tom Palmer, the one, Ant-Man goes inside the Vision and that whole thing. Before that, I was a comic book fan. I liked it. When I saw that changed pretty much everything. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It just kind of blew my mind. And then really that's when it started to become a lot more serious in terms of like, it became, like I said, the hooks were in even deeper at that point. So that, Neil Adams, John Buscema, all those guys really got me interested. I was drawing all the time, drawing my little comics and that kind of thing. So no, it was something I wanted to do since I was probably 6 or 7.
Wow.
So isn't that like Avengers '93? That's what 6.
Yeah, I think that's. I actually may. I have the copy of it here somewhere, but I think that's right.
Yeah, it's funny how certain issue numbers just like stick in your head. Those are like, because back in the day too, is like I would go to the comic book store and they'd have this issue and this issue, but not that issue, and it would take you a while to find that one, that one issue,
Yeah.
So did you take classes? Art classes? Did you draw in high school? Were you doing
93?
Oh, there you go.
Oh, there it is. Wow.
93. Nicely done, Mike. Anyway, so I was always interested, so I would take art classes in in high school and that kind of thing. I never did. There was a local college here that offered art classes. I never really did that. I just did what was available in high school, which wasn't a ton. So I didn't really. I basically just did the high school thing, and then after graduating, I went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. I live here in Pittsburgh. Ron Friends went there. Paul Gulacy went there. So it seemed like, hey, work for those guys. So I went to Art Institute for 2 years.
What kind of training was that? Is that a 2-year?
It's a 2-year school. So
you get an associate's degree.
Yeah. And and so, we were talking before about, people that are just starting out or trying to figure out what they want to do and how that works. I will say that one of the things that there's a local college here, Robert Morris University. Occasionally I'll do some talks to their illustration students. And one of the things I tell them is that, and they asked me where I went, and, I went to Art Institute of Pittsburgh, 2-year associate degree. And that was fine in the early days. But as you get older, and we talk about that, having to pivot, having to be able to change your career a little bit, look for other avenues, that associate's degree does not help. So when work would be slow, guys that I knew that had bachelor's degrees or even master's degrees, but bachelor's more to the point, they could get teaching jobs I couldn't get. So one of the things that I tell students, and they are probably not thrilled to hear it, but I said, look, I know what it was like. I remember coming out of high school and saying, I know these guys, Ron Friends, Paul Gulacy, went to this school. I want to go to this school 2 years and I'll be in the industry. Let's go. But I tell these guys, look, you want to make sure you're prepared when you leave school for the inevitable ups and downs about what's going to happen in your career. Your career is not always, where's my camera? It's not always going to be this. Now, the overall trajectory might be this, but it's going to be a lot of this too. And that education helps smooths out the lows. So,
yeah. I think one of the things that happens is the people who go, it's also very different now because there's all these things about like, oh, you want to do comics, and there's like a million places you can go and take comic book classes.
Yeah, right.
And all that stuff, which didn't exist back in the day, except for like the Kubert School.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was about it.
I didn't think the Kubert School was real for maybe 25 years, because it was like right next to the X-ray specs ads in the back of the comic book. I didn't know it was
It's a Sea Monkey School.
That's right.
I get an entire chest of army men, and I could go to the Kubert School
for $1
There you go. Right.
You pay for your classes by selling Grit.
Yeah, selling Grit magazine. I'm sorry, I mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that.
So did you have? Because in my school I had art, like fine art, and then we had vocational art. Did you have vocational art in your high school?
We did not. Well, not really. I mean, we just took there was like the general kind of art classes. You do you learn paint and different that kind of stuff. But there was no real, it wasn't. It was like a general art class in high school, but there wasn't any vocational aiming to it. So then Art Institute of Pittsburgh is basically it's a commercial art school. So we did design work, and the funny thing was that even though Paul Galassi and Ron Friends, as I mentioned before, some of these guys went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh and became very successful comic book illustrators, comic book art was really not something that they pushed there or seemed to really value there. They would let you know that these guys went there, but there were no classes for that. I mean, you took life drawing classes, you took commercial art classes, design classes, and those kinds of things. But there was nothing specifically comic book related necessarily. So
is that different now? Is that different today? Is that different?
It's very different because the school closed.
Oh,
so they went under. So it's really different.
Yeah.
The sample pages that I worked on before I graduated to start sending around to publishers and stuff, that wasn't like part of a class or anything. I mean, I just kind of did that.
Right.
So that's just, so it was an interesting education. It was helpful in some ways, and in other ways, not so much.
Pat, let me ask you a question about your location, because you're a dyed-in-the-wool Pittsburghian, right? Is that
correct? Yes.
Was especially in I'll call it eras, just to be polite, but like in your era of coming into the comics, did you feel a pressure that you needed to go to New York to get work, or how did you make that work being in Pittsburgh?
Well, I mean, if I guess I had thought about that might be a possibility, but to be honest, I kind of circumvented that to a certain extent by while I was at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, I also was working with just doing like grunt work for a local animation company. Now, that local animation company was it was a local guy that did animation for cartoons and stuff. He came to my school for career day in middle school, and I was like fascinated, like, wow, what does this guy do? And then he said at the end of his little presentation, does anyone want to come and see the studio? And I was the only kid that raised my hand, so I went over and he put me to, I started painting cells and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So the animation company that I became involved with, Ron Friends, also was doing work for another animation company. The two of them worked together. So Ron went to Art Institute of Pittsburgh. Then I met Ron at the animation studio, showed him some of my work. He was very complimentary. So I stayed in touch with him. And that's really what happened. Was after I got out of art school, I started picking up work from like small black and white companies and Eternity Comics, Malibu Comics, that kind of thing. But I had shown my work to Ron, and he eventually showed it to an editor at Marvel, showed it to Ralph Macchio. They said, how about, hey, look, this guy, I think is pretty good. And they said, yeah, okay. So they kind of put it on the shelf. Now, I'll backtrack for a second. During this period, I was also sending in samples. to editors, samples, and getting this giant box of rejection letters. So that was so it wasn't like I suddenly, hey, Ron Friend showed me this editor. Hey, I'm not working. I got a bunch of rejections. So, but Ron showed it to an editor at Marvel and sat on the shelf for a while. So I just kind of did my own thing until they needed work on Tales of Asgard, back up in Thor. And they said, okay, how about this guy? And so they gave me a shot at it, and I did some backup Tales of Asgard stories. No one seemed to hate it, so I did a couple things on Thor. So that was probably, I graduated in 1987.
Oh my God.
I know,
Was
right?
the crust of the earth even formed yet?
I had to run real fast because the magma was still too hot to stand. So then I did that. So I probably started getting work at Marvel in 89, I think, is when I got my Tales of Asgard stuff. And then it just kind of, I did Tales of Asgard, did Thor, a couple of villains, and then Glenn Herdling, I think it was Glenn, walked into Ralph Macchio's office. Hey, the guy, a regular artist on Nomad, just flaked out. We're looking for a new guy. And Ralph said, okay, how about this guy? And he showed him my work. Nomad was my first regular gig, and then it just kind of goes from there.
Pat, I have a couple of kind of backtracking questions. I'm always very interested in those hold your breath moments. Like they mentioned you for the Tales of Asgard thing. You were excitedly, you did your work, you turned it in. Probably, I don't know how that whole situation was.
And you got the call on the landline.
Yeah.
And, right.
Yeah, right.
You had to go to the kitchen. Hello.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. After you, I guess, FedExed or however you sent in your pages, and there's no really impetus that they're going to give you more work. How were you living in that little period of, you turned in a job? Did you feel like you had made it, or you were in, or you weren't? Did you need another line of breadcrumbs?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that having worked in the independence market for a little bit, certainly didn't make much money. I was, indebted to my mom as I was living in the basement and doing that whole, FedEx thing. So it was one of those things where the first Tales of Asgard stories, I think at that point, I was just a kid. I didn't have a ton of expenses. I got a chance to, one of the greatest things was, signing on the Federal Express bill, Marvel Comics on I'm sending this thing to Marvel Comics. Yeah. Oh my God. So I think at that point, the Tales of Asgard thing, no, I did not think that I made it, but and I'm not sure over the years I ever really think that I've made it. So it's one of those things where a job led to another job, but I didn't step back and go big picture, yes, this is it. I've made it. I'm on my way. It was oh my God, I got this job. I got to do this. Oh my God, it's job. Just do the work, do as best you can, turn it in, and hope for the best. So,
and that era, mid 80s, once you got in, and if you proved yourself and you're turned in the stuff on time, easy to work with, there was so much work around because the business was growing, because then starting in, 89 or 90, Marvel launched those 12 new books every year,
Absolutely. Yeah. So there was work, and that was exactly right. So, I mean, the push and pull of it was in the late 80s when I first started, 89, 90, I started getting work at Marvel and DC. That was around the time when, the Image guys had kind of started to change what was sought after in the industry. So nobody was asking me to draw like that necessarily, but the way that the page layout was approached was different. And it started to kind of change, and you would start to get the larger image with the smaller series of panels around it, that kind of thing. But Mike, you're exactly right. At that point, you just got, there was enough work that if you did the job and you met your deadlines, easy to work with, the stuff looked okay, you had work. And that's what happened to me.
Yeah. I also think that the idea, going back to what you were talking about in the beginning, the idea of what a professional was in the mid 80s jived with what our fantasy idea of what a professional was,
right,
based upon the guys, Avengers 93, the people
absolutely
we looked at now. And now that is just so completely different, right?
Yep.
No more gym shooter sleeves.
Well, yeah, because I mean, one of the things was, as I'm sure, like when Shooter was there, he liked guys who did real straight ahead storytelling, which is something that you did. And if you could meet your deadlines, that was it. I remember because I had done some stuff, then I wasn't doing stuff, and I remember Brett, because I knew Brett from when his first trip out when he was moving to New York, Blevins, because he got a contract to work for Marvel. And he said, like, once you got in, basically, like once one editor said yes,
right,
that was sort of like the little trickle of water that became like the big waterfall of work, which was basically true,
It was to a certain extent. The interesting thing in my experience was I was able to get moved from project to project within Marvel.
Right.
I could not get in at DC.
Really?
I could not find work at that. I just never was able to crack that nut. Now I did later. Obviously, I ended up on Catwoman and Hawkman and all that kind of stuff. But for a long period of my career, and part of that is just kind of who's in charge. I mean, who is the editor-in-chief? Who are the editors? What they like, what they're looking for. So it's, you keep knocking on the door, and eventually Steve Wacker was a guy at DC that really liked my work. And eventually when he came in a position to hire guys, then I got work that way. So that's part of it too. It's just kind of the timing of, who's looking for what kind of work that you looking for the work that you do.
Yeah. And you never left Pittsburgh.
No, I never left Pittsburgh. So so I've been here the whole time. Once that connection with Ron sending the work off to Marvel, and I got to work, at home, and the work started to build on itself there. Now I went up to the Marvel offices once for a Marvel picnic thing or something like that. So I got to see the offices, but no, I never left Pittsburgh. I just did everything here.
I think by the mid 80s, you didn't have to do the thing where you moved to New York,
right?
Because of FedEx and all that.
Absolutely,
it all comes back around.
Yeah. I mean, if it had been like 10 years earlier,
it
would have had to been close enough that you could go in and on the train.
Absolutely.
Like all the guys that lived in Connecticut, right?
Yeah,
hop on the train. And ride in,
Yeah. But at that point, when I got in, it wasn't really necessary. And now, some guys would make trips up to New York just to put a name, a face to a name kind of thing, and that probably had some value that I should have done more of. But in terms of the work itself, getting the work done, I really didn't. I just could stay here in Pittsburgh and run like a maniac to Federal Express every other day. So.
Hey, Pat, before we go to the next thing, one of our buddies in the chat, Kirk's Pencils, had a question about kind of like, how does this whole editorial process work? And listening to your story kind of answers a lot of those questions. But I think a very interesting corollary from your start in the business now as to how it works now. Those roads don't work the same way anymore.
Right. Well, in a way they don't, in a way they do. So the mechanism is so much different now. I mean, there wasn't an internet when I didn't have, you weren't putting up your own stories online, or you have your website, you're doing your web comic and all your stuff. There was no way to get a voice out there other than You could print your own stuff, maybe sell it at a convention, send out Xeroxes to editors or whatever. But that mechanism did not exist when I started. So it is a completely different world now. Having said that, there is something about, about networking, about knowing somebody. Now that doesn't change. Now I met Ron Friends. He's very, nice guy, liked my work, and decided to kind of help me get in the door. Okay. So that piece of it, that networking piece is still the same today.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
That hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can still go to a convention and you still meet somebody.
Yeah.
I'm always encouraging young artists to do that, to go to conventions, meet people, go up and talk to people.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, for guys of our era, that was pretty standard. Is that you would start out, you get an 8-page job, you get a backup in an annual, things like that, right? They wouldn't just start off like, okay, here's X-Men.
Yeah. Right.
X-Men kid.
Yeah, exactly right. And the thing the advantage that guys have today is because they can have a place online to do their work, to show what they do, and that it's accessible to people. I mean, you send a link to an editor, or you can build your own community.
Yeah. You
can start building up your own community on your own. That gets noticed too. So there are so many more avenues today than there wasn't. I don't want to sound like an old crank, but I mean, there are, social media and the internet and everything that goes with it, has pluses and minuses, but it certainly gives you more opportunities to have your work out there.
Oh yeah. I mean, just even when I think back to the 80s, when people would want you to make a transparency or a slide, right? You remember when you had to make slides for everything, right? Even in the beginning, like if you wanted to show your work to a gallery or you wanted to enter the show, you had to go make a slide of your stuff to send it away, and I remember doing that, making transparencies.
Yeah.
It was all these
how did we live like that, Mike? It's terrible. My God, it's like
that lasted a long time. Where like even when there was email, people would still say, "Look, well, I want a slide. Send me a slide." And like of course now you can't even find slide. You can't even get slide.
Yeah, do you even have a slide projector anymore?
I don't. My dad still does, and you can still get that stuff, but in the 90s, everything in comics was always, like I always say, comics was like the last man, like, okay, I'll get a computer. Okay, comics was always like the last man standing when it came to technology. And basically they did it because the printers were like, we can't do your old fashioned stuff anymore. So if you want to get Spider-Man made, you got to go out and you got to update your stuff,
Absolutely.
So speaking of that, maybe this would be a great time to look at some artwork. What do you think, Pat?
Do you think it's my artwork?
Yeah.
What are the chances?
And Pat, how are you doing for time? You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, cool. All right, guys, we're going to share some of Pat's artwork and we get to marvel at it with you. Do you want to kind of talk through some of the images, Pat?
So this was a cover I did for Aftershock for a new book, Astronaut Down. They did. It was a variant cover I did for the Pittsburgh convention. But this was all digital. That was one of the first. I wouldn't say one of the first pieces I did, but it's the first large piece, like a cover piece I did that's all digital. And it was a piece that I was super happy with it, but it was one of those things where after experimenting with different brushes and approaches and that kind of stuff, this cover, I looked at it when I was done. I went, okay, that actually looks closer to what's in my head. So I was pretty happy with it just because it kind of did what I wanted it to do. It's been transitioning digitally has been a real learning curve. It hasn't always worked well. But I could see where the possibilities were, where it could go, what I could do with it. And this was a cover that when I did it, I thought, okay, I think I might be on the right track.
Did you pencil it on and digitally, or did you pencil it traditionally and then ink it digitally?
No, whole thing is digital. So it was, I have a page template that I use. It's a page template that I've been using for a while. No, it's just on a layer. I reduced this image down so it felt more like a thumbnail. So it was like smaller, so you could think. So I just did all that digitally, sketched it out digitally, and then kind of blew it up, did another layer, tightened it up, another layer, then I penciled it, and then inked it all digitally. There was no traditional in any of that.
How are you loving Clip, or have you played around with any other programs besides?
I played around with. I've seen guys working with Procreate, and they're using some of the brushes that I see, like Gigi Cavanago. I don't know how. I'm probably screwing that name up. But there are guys out there that are doing things digitally with and they're getting a look to their brush and their line that I can't figure out.
Mm-hmm.
So I play around with Procreate a little bit and have been trying some of their brushes, but overall I keep coming back to Clip Studio because it just seems to be more intuitive for me. I don't know if that's because, like, if I started off as an art student and just started digitally, maybe Clip would not be what I picked. But because I worked traditionally so long, Clip just seemed more like an easier transition for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think specifically for doing the kind of stuff, the kind of feel that we like.
Yep.
I think so. I find that Photoshop just always seems like real hard and clunky to me. I could never.
Yeah. I can't. I do color. Sometimes I'll play around with colors and stuff in Photoshop, but in terms of like penciling and inking, Clip just seemed to be just a better fit for me.
The inking and Clip is just like hands down.
Yep.
Like other things are kind of wispy sometimes, but the inking is great.
Yeah.
I'll throw another image on here, and I can leave these up or switch them out.
Whatever you want to do.
And Patrick, who are your influences? Who are the ones who informed your work early on? Because it is so strong. I love these pieces so much.
Thanks.
I don't just gush on social media. I honestly just look. I love these, and
I appreciate it. So this was I did a little run on Barbed Wire for Dark Horse with Chris Warner. So that was fun. I mean, I was sorry it didn't do better. We couldn't have a longer run on it. I seem to say that a lot, but when talking about some of my projects, but it was a fun character. So I really had a good time with it. In terms of influences, initially the biggest influence was Neil Adams. That was the guy that melted my brain and said, "What? I didn't know what is this." So. And then John Buscema as well. So those were the early guys: Neil Adams, John Buscema, Sal Buscema, and then as I got older, Jim Aparo, another one. That guy he's insane. I mean, I'm just in awe. The fact that he was able to pencil and ink and letter a monthly comic for all those years with that high quality. I just can't get my brain around it. So, and then as I got older, more guys. I mean, John Byrne was a big, also an influence. It wasn't until I didn't really consider him an influence in terms of my art style necessarily, but he's in there because I was collecting during the time when he was, it was X-Men. I thought his Fantastic Four run was amazing. So. That's in there too, and then the other big influence, and I think it's easier to see when I ink my own work, is Bill Sienkiewicz. His work on Moon Knight, in terms of inking Moon Knight, Bill Sienkiewicz, Klaus Janson, those guys were also big influences.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. That sort of, you love to put a lot of texture.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I do like that. Yeah.
Pat, I have another question just about the changing from traditional to digital. Did you go through a period of having to make kind of like rules for yourself about like zooming in too much or noodling too much?
that was a real challenge. And some of the early pieces didn't turn out as well. But what I figured out, so what I did was I could not get the hang of. Sometimes it was too heavy. Sometimes it was too fine. I was zooming in too much, because it's like anything else. Traditionally, you're working, you're drawing something, and then what do? You do this. You sit back to kind of look at it, and then you lean back in. Well, digitally, you have to zoom out and zoom in, but it's harder to know where you are in that process. It's easy for me to do this and then sit back, and now I can see it. So what I ended up doing was the template that I use for my comics work digitally is one that mirrors a traditional Marvel Comics board.
Oh, gotcha.
With the crop marks and all the indications. So what I did was I thought, okay, I need some way to figure out where I am in this. Am I too close, too far? So what I did was I took a Marvel board and I laid it next to the screen, and I blew the screen up to where the crop marks matched the Marvel board.
Oh, okay.
I knew at that percentage that what I was looking at is exactly the same as I would be looking at if I was working this traditionally.
What?
Once I got the proportion, once I knew what that percentage was, then I would zoom in a little bit, zoom out a little bit, that kind of thing. But I always knew I had to be around that percentage so that I could be comfortable with what I was doing, so that when it reproduced, it should look okay. So that's how I figured that out for myself anyway.
That's a great hack.
Yeah. Because one of the things we talked with other artists about digitally is traditionally you're always aware of the whole thing all the time.
That's right.
Even when you're here, you still see the whole thing in total. But when you're working digitally, like if you're going to ink her face, you don't probably see anything. You only see like the face and maybe a little bit of the rest of it.
And that's why that zoom in trick worked, because you still zoom out to get a sense of where you are. So you do have to do that. You get a sense of the size of the scale, and so it all kind of works cohesively. But I had traditional art next to me that I penciled, like some Rough Rider pages that I had penciled and inked. So once I had the percentage right, where I would zoom in, I could tell as I was inking it, and I had my traditional to my left, I could tell I would kind of glance back and forth a little bit, and I went, wait a minute, those lines are never going to reproduce, or those lines are way too thick. Look what I was doing over here. Yeah. That looks like I inked it with my foot. So it's one of those. So it was kind of a cobbling together of those two ideas.
Well, the chat sure loves your hack. Your art hack.
Well, yeah, it worked. It worked pretty well. So.
All right.
Wow. So I got to do so I got to do some work on. I worked at Disney for 2 years, so on their Marvel storybooks. So that was a lot of fun. I mean, that was I loved that experience. Loved the guys I worked with. Super fun to tell these kind of stories for kids. And got to, they flew me out to Book Expo America. That was a great experience. When that ended, I started getting work back in comics again. I picked up some work on Captain Marvel. It was a lot of fun to make the transition. It was great working on the children's books, but they were more single image jobs, and they had a certain style to them. So when I got back into comics and picked up some work like I said on Captain Marvel, and I got to do a big space scene. I remember drawing this double page splash. Again, loving my time at Disney, but drawing this and going, oh, this feels so good. I feel like this is what I know. So that was a good experience.
Wow, that's an incredible spread.
What years were you working on that Marvel stuff? Because both Brett and I also worked on some Marvel books, but then they scrapped it and supposedly restarted it. So maybe you came on after.
No, it was a long time. I was one of the first I was one of the first guys to work on the books, is my understanding, because I had talked to Mike Seglain, who was an editor, who used to be my editor at DC. Now he was over there, and I was looking for work at the moment, and but I remember wishing him a Merry Christmas, and that was all I said. And he wished me a Merry Christmas back and said, "Hey, can you draw me a Spider-Man head?" I said, "Sure." So I drew a Spider-Man, sent it off, and he said, "I'll tell you why I need it." So then I did a couple more. He said, "Look," he said, "we have these Marvel properties, and now we're making storybooks out of them." He said the studios that they normally work with in California are not necessarily capturing what superheroes look like. And this is fine, but they are used to drawing like Peter Pan or Tinkerbell. That's not what we want. So when I sent Mike the work, he said, I showed it to my bosses and said, "Look, we need this." And that's how I ended up getting the job.
That's crazy.
It's funny you say that, because that was one of the issues, I think, when I was working, because I did when the first Captain America came out.
Yeah.
I was working on it before the movie came out.
Yeah.
And the culture at Disney was not the culture at Marvel.
Right.
And there was a little bit of a clash between what the guys at Disney, like you said, know what Peter Pan or Tinkerbell or whatever Disney is, but they did not necessarily understand what Jack Kirby was,
right. Yeah,
and so
that was it. Yeah, there was definitely a disconnect. So they needed to bring in somebody, some guys that experience in that area of illustration.
Did you have to work on layers?
No. I provided pencil artwork that was then painted over.
Right.
So that's basically how they put it together.
That's really wild. And it's funny, I don't know if you see this out in the wild once in a while. Kind of like how everybody always had this kind of bug up their butts about Comic Sans. But when you see kind of like superhero illustrations, you just kind of look at it and go, that guy's not a comic book dude. You can tell, is there something just kind of like inherently, kind of like the AI hands, right, Steve? Like something's just not right.
Yeah.
Or you're in Buffalo and they say, get a Philly cheesesteak, and like, no, man, that is not a cheesesteak.
That's right. I love it.
There you go.
I could just drink in this spread here. So
Absolutely.
So Patrick, what somebody would usually ask is, because the first thing that comes to mind is, wow, how long did that take?
Yeah.
Sure. Right.
Right. And I always wonder why people ask that. But like generally, if this is part of a monthly book you're doing, how are you kind of divesting your time to make sure you can do something as illustrative as this?
Well, it's one of those things where two things is, one of them is once you have the script, if you're lucky enough to have the whole script in front of you,
that's new.
Doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
But if you have a sense of what you're doing, then you know that 2 or 3 pages after this, it's going to be more like some talking heads or a single big image or something. I said, okay, that I know will go quicker, so I can borrow time from that to spend on this. The other piece of it also is that there's also part of your brain that this seemed like a good idea at the time, and I'm very happy with the way it turned out. But as the deadline was getting closer and I was staying up later and drawing all those little freaking asteroids, I started thinking this might have been a mistake. But at that point, I was so happy with it and committed to it. It was one of those things where there are certain pages that happen over the course of a job that basically is going to might wreck your deadline, but I'm just going to do it. I'm going to commit to that time to do that page the way I wanted to do it. So, right. What brush did I use? Right.
Yeah. I guess people ask that. Yeah. How long did it take? Like if you said 17 hours, you'd be like, oh man, if you did it at 15, I would have liked it.
Right. Right.
But you took 17 hours. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
You
That
know,
that was weird. I remember. I don't know if this is still a thing, but when everybody was kind of hanging out on DeviantArt, a lot of people would put that into their notes. Like it took me 28 hours to do the Grand Theft Auto illustration. And I was like,
Right.
who asked? Anyway, let me turn the page. This is
Well,
great.
let me ask if this piece was illustrated to be painted over.
Mm.
No, okay. So this after Disney was. I left Disney.
Okay.
And was now getting back into Marvel Comics. So this was a traditional that got ink colored. Threw some staples in it, and made a Captain Marvel comic out of it.
I was wondering how that changed, how that would affect your approach to illustrating or penciling something, knowing that another artist would be doing such radical finishes.
At that point, it was I knew that the nuts and bolts of it were going to pretty much stay the same. And it's kind of like, okay, I knew that there was going to be some impact in the final choice, in the final product. There was going to be, it was going to be the painter's voice as much, if not more than my voice. But I enjoyed drawing it. So I knew that, I got to draw, the Avengers saving Captain America from the ice, that old Jack Kirby thing. I got to draw that. That was in a children's book. So I just loved drawing it. And, they're going to paint over it. They're going to paint over it. That's fine.
I love the love of drawing that shines through. All right, here you go. Here's another heater.
Yeah, so that was my run on Catwoman. So again, this was just because I was trying to experiment more with page layout. The kind of the criticism of my work tends to be that it can be too quiet. And being a fan of Neil Adams, I mean, all those X-Men layouts he used to do, they're like crazy slashing panels all over the place.
Yeah.
So I don't go that far, but occasionally, like on Catwoman, I wanted to experiment with bigger images and also overlapping images. So how can I get, like, the top panel, she's coming out of the building on the left, she's kind of coming this way, you follow Catwoman down, then try not lead the eye a little bit more. So that was just kind of an experimental page that I thought worked out pretty well.
Is there anyone that you looked at in particular that gave you like to study layouts? Because usually people think of like, well, I like an artist for their style or their drawing style.
Right.
But are there certain artists that you would follow because you liked their layout style?
Yeah, I mean, most of my early influences, like Neil Adams, I liked Howard Chaykin's layout style, like on American Flag. A more graphic approach, I thought that was kind of cool. So, and then, to be honest, I just saw a lot of the guys that were coming in, younger guys that were experimenting more with page layouts and kind of moving the images around. So I would just kind of look at what other guys were doing and thinking, wow, maybe I could, it inspired me to do something like that too.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times people think about when you're influenced, you're more influenced by drawing style or isms than actually like layout. And it used to be back in the day that you had a lot of guys who were like, I always think like Ross Andrew was a guy like that who had great layouts. His drawing had a certain sort of like mannered or kind of like sort of sometimes a little ugly in a way, not pretty like Romita, but he was fantastic layouts. So,
yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, especially like when you're doing cities like this where you've got, lots of windows and lines.
And this who else does great cities? Ron Friends. I mean, his worlds, he does these great, like when he was on Superman and stuff, these great cityscapes. So yeah, I mean, he's another guy that, I mean, I shared studio space with Ron for years, and yeah, so he's another guy that does just amazing cityscapes, city backgrounds, environments, all that kind of stuff. And that's what I always loved about drawing comics as opposed to a single illustration, was that you create an environment.
Right.
You know, some of my, you know, one of my favorite scenes that I drew in Spider-Girl wasn't necessarily a scene where she was fighting a villain. It was the quieter scenes, you know, just like in a room or you know. So those kinds of things where you create an environment, that's half the fun.
Right. Yeah. No, I think when you're younger, you want to draw, you know, all the action and that, you know, that's what attracts you. But then you have all those pages where Peter Parker has to talk to Mary Jane or J. Jonah Jameson. And it's the build up of that makes the other stuff exciting, because if it was just all constantly people pounding each other in the face, it would get kind of monotonous. Yeah,
exactly right. And you don't feel like you're pulled into the world as much, because all of that cacophony and action are super exciting, but at the same time, you need the quieter moments so that you are pulled into the story. And really, and I don't know, I mean, maybe that's how I read comics when I was a kid, is that you just kind of disappear into that world. And so that's the value of creating environments.
Yeah.
Pat, I had a question. I have so many questions. Pat, I have a question about this high level proficiency of penciling. Has there been points in your career where you just didn't want to see how it got inked, or like do you have kind of like a relationship with how things get finished? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Now, when I first started, I remember Ron, when I showed him my early work, he talked about having a finishing style, like a style, like it's not like you're penciling it, so necessarily it could be printed right off of that, but you have a more cohesive style. When I first started in comics, I was a mess. I mean, I was not as controlled as anything near this. Mark McKenna was my first inker on Nomad, and you know, I've apologized to him because the pencils were kind of a little on the messy side. So, but anyway, but in terms of the inks, that early on in my career, that was a little bit of an issue. Is you spend enough time, and then you know the inker adds what he adds to it, and so. But that's the nature of the business, right? I mean, if you're going to ink your own work, you can solve that. But at the same time, I had a conversation with Paul Neary at one point about it, and I told him that my approach at that point in my career was that the artwork that shows up in a comic book is not the artwork of Patrick Ollifffe. It is the artwork of, you know, Patrick Williamson, Shield. I mean, it's three or four artists that are putting that out, that are showing up in that comic book. So you kind of have to take a step back when you look at the book. That's really not what I had in mind, or that got lost here, or why did they make those choices? Well, that's because that's a different dude. I mean, whoever created that comic book, that's a conglomerate of three artists, a penciler, inker, and colorist. And we all have our ideas, and we all kind of, you know, put them in there. So when it's printed, that's somebody else. I mean, that's obviously partly me, but it's also those guys too, or girls. And but stuff like this, that's me. You know, so the inking thing, I kind of had to come to grips with in terms of, okay, it's a collaboration.
Yeah. As I know, like, just, you know, as we talked about the early excitement of just doing a thing, but then it's kind of out of your hands, and then you don't see it again until you're like, I don't know, at lunch with your buddies at the comic book shop, and you're like, oh, let me check this out. Oh man, what they totally took out the, you know. But
yeah, no, early in my career, and there were a lot of you know, times where I was looking at a comic, you know, slumped over weeping, like, oh my God, it isn't what I thought it was going to be. But that's that's fine. That's it. Like I said, I realized fairly quickly. Okay, it's a collaboration. So the inker is adding what he adds, and he has a voice, the colorist and letterer, and so
yeah. And also that era, it's also different from today because back then you might want to request an inker on your work.
Yeah, I mean you could, and I did, but especially
when you get it.
No, I didn't have that kind of power. I mean, there was like if I got a job, I would provide the editor with a list of inkers, and I would say, hey, how about this guy, this guy, this guy? Sometimes I get lucky and they would pick one. More often than not, they would pick their own. So I didn't have the power to say, hey, I'm showing up here with my guy. I just, I make suggestions and they can take them or not take them.
Right. And you also couldn't talk to the other creative people like you can now. I mean, like now, if you pencil something and you send it, you've got the person's email address. You can go over.
Right.
They can send you something and go, do you like this? Is this working?
Right.
I mean, back then it was like the editor kept all that stuff like real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They didn't like you talking to the other guys.
Does it has that changed a little bit? I guess they can't really control it anymore. It's out of their hands.
Yeah, it's out of their hands. Yeah, there's really not much you can do about it.
Do you want to talk us through this piece?
Yeah, so this one is the cover for my creator-owned book, Edge World. I'm doing with Chuck Austin through Comixology. That it's been great. We've kind of paused for a little bit, but we will soon be returning. But it's a sci-fi western. It was an idea that Chuck and I we worked together years ago on a little project called the Call, which lasted all of like 3 issues. Nobody ever saw any of it, and but he and I got along enough that as I got later in my career, I thought, okay, I want to do a creator-owned project, and so I wanted to see what that was like. I was talking to Chuck, and he and I had been kind of knocking around a couple ideas, came up with a couple of things. No one seemed interested, but this one seemed to click. We found a home at Comixology, and we got 5 issues out. There'll be another 5-issue series at some point. And it's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
Why don't
very different experience.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk a little bit about? So that's a little bit different, dealing with Comixology, and I guess how do you pitch? Do you come up and you pitch them something, and if they go yes, they work out a deal. You get a page rate and all that kind of stuff. Because I mean, there's all these various. Again, you could start out now just starting at a Comixology and never work for a Warlord.
Absolutely. So now the contact, we talked about this before, this networking thing. The contact came from Chuck. He knew Chip at Comixology, and so he made the pitch. So when they bought it, it was set up with so there would be payments in chunks, and that would pay for certain, it would be enough to pay for us for certain issues. Then you upload a couple more issues, you get a chunk, that kind of thing. So yeah, we were able to make the finances work, but the initial contact was through Chuck. He knew Chip.
Love it.
So anyway, that was the piece that I did when Chuck approached Comixology. That's the piece I did to help sell the property, which eventually I kind of repurposed for one of the covers because I'm lazy.
No, that's fantastic.
Lazy, yeah.
Yeah, we use the whole bird here. I love it.
Do you feel when you're working on what was your first, I guess, creator-owned project? Because when you get in and you're hitting the ground running, like you were talking about in the 80s, when you're just trying to stay in the ring and get more work.
Yeah.
Were you aware of the fact, at what point were you aware of the fact that you needed to do something else? And then was there a period of adjustment, or I guess, like, how did you judge that? Because, like, if you're drawing Spider-Man or you're drawing the Avengers,
Right.
you judge it against the heroes that you admire,
Right.
right? You
Right.
go like, oh, if I'm drawing Batman, it's
Right.
Neil Adams or Jim Aparo or whatever.
Right.
Now, when you're doing your own thing,
Right.
completely you can do whatever you want.
Right.
Was there a period of adjustment? Like, how do you judge that?
Well, I think there is, but what made the transition to Edgeworld easier is because I mean, I really wasn't getting a lot of work at Marvel at that point. I'd been getting work at DC, but one of the things, this is a page of Rough Riders that I did for Aftershock, which is essentially creator owned, although I wasn't. Adam Glass made the pitch, and there was another artist involved that didn't work out, and then they brought me on. So, and we did I think three series of this. I think I was worked on Rough Riders for almost 2 years. One of my favorite projects. I loved working on it. But that was an experience where there wasn't a Neil Adams or Jim Aparo that did this before. So I think at that point I'd spent 2 years kind of heading in my own direction that made that transition to Edgeworld a little bit easier.
Okay, because I think you meet young artists today because of the way the environment is. You might start out just doing your own webcomic and developing your own your own feeling and body of work.
Yeah.
And you don't have anybody editorially necessarily saying like, well, can you make it a little bit more like this or a little bit more like that? Which is something that everyone
there's a benefit though to that. Right. I mean, there's a benefit to working to a certain extent, working in corporate comics, Marvel, DC, working with an editor, working with a team, getting feedback, listening to critiques, that kind of thing. If you are just, it's like, I would think that it's a little bit more difficult, not having had this experience, but it'd be a little more difficult to just be so completely on your own, where you write, you draw, you put up your webcomic, or it's just without input from anybody, then you can easily find yourself, down a rabbit hole that you don't want to go. I mean, it's just like your work is not. So I think that was one of the benefits of working in a structure that you had to answer to an editor. You had, you worked with other, pencil or with ink or colors or whatever. Getting other people's input, I think, is important.
You know what? It's funny you brought that up, Pat, because, talking to different people about different aspects of doing our business, because, like you said, like somebody who does webcom, or even like our own Steve Conley, who's
middle age, which is awesome,
right? Who's the
absolutely?
He's the master of his domain.
Oh, I know. That's exactly right. But Steve, you also have clients that you worked outside. Had commercial clients, other clients. You understand working with a team prior to middle age. Is that correct?
Oh, and concurrent with middle age and long after that series ends, no doubt. Yeah.
Sure.
So, I mean, just being able to I think you build a couple of walls around you. Like when it's just you and nobody is patting you on the head, you have to land all the planes. You're the air traffic controller and the pilot at the same time.
All right.
But kind of being in a situation where I guess you come from being by yourself into a situation where there are now people, either you bristle against that or you fall.
And everybody has to make that choice, right? Because everybody gets to the point where if you just listen to everybody else's input, you would never get anything done.
Yeah.
There's an opposite side to that, so that it's not, so the one side is you're in your own head so much, you're down in a rabbit hole and nothing you're doing is making sense. The other side of it is you are constantly pivoting to whatever opinion somebody has, and you never get anything done either. So at some point, you have to be able to take in criticism and learn from it. But then at some point, you also have to say, screw this, I'm doing it my way. There has to be that, that balance or that point where you take that next step.
Right.
Was there a path to realizing that? Was that something
I just
you
figured
picked
it
up
out
quickly?
right now.
It just happened.
Sorry, Mike, that was bad timing.
Well, I ask that because very often you meet a young person and they're trying to do their, they're starting out, they're doing their world building. But it's much harder because you don't have anything to compare it to.
Right.
Like I said, if you're doing Spider-Man,
Right.
that world is built.
Absolutely.
Right. So there's a lot of stuff that you don't have to absorb.
Right.
Spend time like, I need to invent all these secondary characters because they've already been invented.
Yep.
The world of Marvel has been invented, and it kind of like already lives in your head. So did you scrap pages? Did you do stuff over?
Well, I think once we got rolling on Edgeworld, I didn't really scrap any pages because at that point I had kind of started to develop an idea of what I wanted. But that was really one of the first times, probably the first time, where I did feel like, in almost kind of a good way, it was a little scary because I was showing stuff to Chuck and that kind of thing, but who's also an artist. But I was really in my own head. I mean, basically, that world didn't exist. How much sci-fi, how much Western, what we were doing. I took Chuck's scripts, and so I knew what kind of like the world that was behind all this, but none of it existed. And I kind of did my own thing. And that's a little scarier when you're just kind of thinking, God, I hope someone doesn't think this is ridiculous. But that cobbling together, that creation, that's the first time I ever really had to do that. No, it was fun.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean,
I could design something. There were characters in there. I designed a character, and I'm thinking, boy, I should. No, wait a second. I don't have to show it to anybody. If I think it works, hey, it works. That's great.
There it is.
So
right.
I want to get to your last couple slides here.
Sure.
And Pat, we're going to start wrapping it up. Guys, we had a fantastic episode so far. I hope everybody has enjoyed this, hanging out with Pat. You want to talk about the Spider-Girl page real quick?
So that was, obviously went out, I was on Spider-Girl for 5 years after, Ron Frenz and Tom DeValco created the character in What If 105, and they sprung it out to a series. The whole MC2 universe, a whole bunch of books that came out of that. So this was just one of my favorite splash pages just because I always loved those Spider-Man comics that had the, like the multiple image, Spider-Man multiple image, like bouncing across rooftops and stuff. And I got to do some of that in Untold Tales. But I always liked doing that. And so this is a layout that I wanted to play around with so that, you're kind of like in the middle of it, like she's jumping over you. Mm-hmm. And the pumpkin bombs are all hitting her. So everything is coming down to that one point. And you're kind of like in the middle of it. But the thing that behind that was I just always loved and there really isn't any other character other than maybe the Flash back in the Irv Novick days that there really is another character that does a lot of those consistently those multiple image things. Mm-hmm. That was always such a part of Spider-Man, and I wanted to play around with that in the Spider-Girl book too. So.
That's very
cool. And Miller kind of did that in Daredevil.
Right. Oh yeah, he did. Absolutely. And that was for an Untold Tales annual. And the only reason is that's one of my favorite Spider-Man poses.
That's fantastic.
So it's just one of those things where you said, hey, do you want to send some artwork over? And I don't know. I was always super happy. When I finished it, I thought, that's it. That's Spider-Man for me. So.
I love the squash and stretch you have going on.
Yeah.
Did you feel like certain projects you were able to kind of flex some of your different muscles?
Very much so. Untold Tales of Spider-Man was a big piece of that because when I started on Untold Tales of Spider-Man, I had done Nomad and Warlock and some those kinds of things, But I knew that when I was on Untold Tales that I needed to kind of change my approach on how I handled the figures. I looked obviously at Steve Ditko, but I also looked a lot at Rick Leonardi. And and the way he just made the body move and everything, I knew that I had to really push that a lot more. I had to basically, in parts of him, kind of take parts of his skeleton out to get his legs to do what I wanted it to do. But I had I kind of had to play around with that kind of figure work more. And Untold Tales was really the first time I really got to play around with that.
And I'm here for armpit webs.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'm with you, Jamar.
We need more. We need more of that.
Yes, we do.
It's funny you mentioned that thing about taking the bones out, because I remember watching a making of the first Spider-Man, the Sam Raimi stuff. And in order to get Spider-Man to stick on the wall, like we do in comics, when you take a human being, he cannot actually walk up. So they actually had to like the way his hip bones would bend and all that stuff.
Right.
A human being can't actually naturally bend like that. So
speak for yourself, Mike, man.
But I remember seeing that in there, and I think, see, again, that's one of the great things about comics is that you can do that and you just accept it.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's part of the deal.
That rubbery femur. That's just fantastic.
Yes. There you go.
I love
exactly
it.
Exactly.
I need to put this on the back of my jean jacket. I love it.
That's fantastic.
But it doesn't work as well on, like, when I was on Warlock. It didn't work. I couldn't do that with Warlock. You know what I mean? I couldn't do that really with Hawkman either. I mean, that kind of, you can do squash, the stretchy figure and the action poses, but you can accept it if it's Spider-Man. You don't accept it if it's Hawkman. I mean, that's my sense of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unless it's Steve Ditko drawing it, and then
exactly right. Exactly.
Then everything is up for grabs.
Right.
And I think that's it. Is that it? I think that's it.
I think that's it.
Is that something you inked yourself?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So so yeah, I think everything that I sent over, if it's inked, I inked it myself.
Do you? I don't. I hate to say, do you enjoy one more than the other? But I know there are a lot of traditional pencilers who would hate to ink themselves, and then there's other people who would rather do it if they could.
Yeah, I would rather do it if I could. I was just never fast enough. I mean, my goal, and my goal getting into comics was to do what the guys that I admired did. I mean, John Buscema, John Byrne, Jim Aparo, these guys, every month, there was another issue of the work that they did. So in order to do that too, I couldn't ink my own work. I wasn't fast enough. But given the opportunity, I would prefer to ink it myself. I mean, I was very fortunate to work with a lot of super talented inkers. I mean, with Al Williamson, Mark McKenna, Tom Palmer, all these guys. And they bring something specific to it. But, if I had a choice, I'd prefer to just ink my own work, because that's the closest to the final product is as close to what was in my head if I ink it myself.
Right.
So
that was fantastic. The chat would like to address the court and tell us that they, thanks to Eternity Forever, call it the broken hip syndrome. Tom McFarlane is the author of that Spider-Man. That's interesting.
There you go.
Pat, we're going to get you out of here, but I just wanted to kind of wrap up with some of the questions that were hanging around in the chat. First, the statement. Our good friend Wolf E says, Rough Riders was a fun series. Really enjoyed the art and cast of characters.
Thank you.
That's a feather in your cap, Pat.
Oh yeah, it remains one of my favorite series. It was a thrill to work on. Absolutely thrill. And I love, when people, didn't sell blockbuster numbers. So I'm always thrilled when I still get guys come up to a convention and plop thumb down and have me sign some copies. I loved it.
That's
So
great.
thank you.
Thanks, Wolfie. And also, this is a great segue into our last question about: do you do a lot of conventions? I mean, beyond the pandemic happening, everything. Do you do a lot of shows?
I don't. I do there's a local show here in Pittsburgh. I do, but I think the post-pandemic, I think I probably am going to try to do more, and part of that is because we talked about that transition earlier, kind of almost reintroducing yourself or keeping yourself in front of the fans, other creators, public, that kind of thing. So I probably would end up doing more conventions. I say that, and I know people that know me will hear me say that and go, he's full of crap. He's not doing it. But I'm going to try to do more shows.
Well, there's a question from our new friend DT Artman, who's been waiting very patiently and says, quick questions. When you guys sell at conventions, what pictures of characters have you sold the most? So maybe when you do cons, are you selling original art? Are you doing head sketches?
No, all my original artwork is sold through Scott Kress at Catskill Comics.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's where I usually take my commissions as well. My commission list is open, by the way. What I sell most, so at conventions I have prints and books, and then I'll do sketches at conventions. Mm-hmm. And really the character, not surprisingly, I think the character I get asked to do most tends to be probably neck and neck a Spider-Man, Spider-Girl.
Gotcha. Thank you, DT Artman. And also, this just came in hot off the press. Someone in the chat. I told you all types of superstars hang out in the chat room here.
I had this, like, the hair went back up on the back of my neck, and my hands were all sweaty, and I said something's happening, and then all of a sudden there he is. So,
your friend sense was tingling.
Exactly. Yes. No, Ron is a good friend of mine. We've known each other for years, shared studio space together, and he's one of the most talented guys I know.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Ron.
So take that, Ron.
Yeah.
Can't say anything about it.
That's right. And if you missed it, we had a really fantastic session with Ron a couple months back. So go to the archives and check that out. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for hanging out. All right, we're gonna get you out of here so you can go pee, Pat. You were a fantastic guest. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So where do people follow you on Instagram and Facebook and?
Well, I noticed that they've been very kind to put my Instagram on a scroll right here.
Yeah, look at that.
POLLIFF65. I am still currently on Twitter at Pat Olliff 65. I'm not sure how much longer that'll last, but for now anyway, that's where I am.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
And someday I'll have a website.
Well, and I've been saying this a lot, is one of the things I always say here on the thing is, where'd the time go?
Yeah.
I don't know if you felt like this was like holding in some gas, but I feel like this went really smoothly.
That was good. I appreciate it. That was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was great. We're great catching up. See, everybody, it's like you could do 2 or 3 of these in a row.
That's right.
Yeah, we didn't have to pee.
That's right. So, all right, guys, we're going to get out of here. Thank you to my co-hosts, Mike and Steve, and thank you to our guest, Pat. Before we go, we got some bills to pay. And I just want to say to everybody, we'll be back next week. I don't think we know what we're doing next week, but we'll let you know as soon as we know. So as we do our sign off, and we coach Pat in the green room so he knows what to do. Ladies and gentlemen, we're still in the pandemic, so I would be remiss if I did not tell you to wash those curvy hands. Put them up, Pat. Let's see it. Oh, that's good. That's nice. All right, guys, have a great evening. Get some sleep.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Thanks.